This video explains the basics of how to plan a customized layout based on your preferences.
Hello and welcome to a video tutorial in which we will get started on planning the new model railroad. Yeah, in my garage here. Let's start with an update of what's been happening since last you were here, because then everything was in a mess. It's still in a mess for sure. But at least I have unpacked some of the many cardboard boxes and at least get some, order into all the stuff I brought with me to this new house.
First, a recap. This is what the garage looked like when I published the last video. A lot of cardboard boxes and all in a mess. Now a bit better. I have purchased these cupboards which are on wheels, so they could be rolled under the layout. And they keep most of the stuff I need in the garage. I still have the heater here. Next week the plumber comes in and change the heater and move it out of the garage. But I feel ready to get started planning the model railroad anyway.
So basically when I'm planning a new model railroad, I'm using a 5-step process. And the first step is selection of prototype, meaning where is this layout placed in the world, and what are we trying to to build a miniature of here, and also the components you or the user, or in this case me, wants to really have on their model railroad. Is it a engine shed, which is very important with the roundhouse and turntable or stuff, or is it a really large main station, or is it, whatever. There are typically some components everyone needs to have, and then you make a priority list of those. So that's the first thing I typically do. The second is to select the line type. You know, what type of line do you desire to have on your layout? Is it a linear line design where the line basically follows the walls around, and then where the walls ends, well, that's where the line ends. And then the third step is to select type, mode of operation, and also the shape of the layout. And then you have to cram it all into the the available space, of course. That's always a tricky thing. So the room fitting. And once we're ready with the room fitting, we can start doing the track planning. And if you want to do that in a software like AnyRail, I use AnyRail. Or if you want to just do it on a paper, it doesn't really matter. The important thing is that you get all these 5 things done before you get started on framework or the actual build of the layout. And then one of the more common questions I get is especially from people who wants to get started on model railroad, but they have not previously had any experience or very little experience, so they don't have a really good idea of what they want to accomplish with their layout, what components to include. And for a first time build, if you're new to model railroad, you haven't built anything, it looks fun, and I want to run some trains with the kids or on my own, or whatever your object is with this model railroad, I would recommend you typically to get a layout plan book. There are tons of them out there, both from the manufacturers of tracks, like Pico, for instance. They have a really affordable track plan book there, which you can buy and just get a flavor for what you can do in the space you have available, and or buy a more extensive book. That's a really good start, because then you don't have to think all that much about track work and all the bits and pieces. You don't have to take in all that much information. You can get started with your build much sooner. And if you don't have any specific objects in going into I would say this phase of planning a model railroad with these 5 steps, then you don't really have a use for it either. Then it's better to go for, I would say, a ready-made track plan, which has been made from someone who is experienced in track planning. So, who am I and what are my preferences? Well, I'm a kind of operational guy, so I want to run trains, both passenger traffic, preferably on automatic. I'm not all that thrilled about the running passenger trains around my layout. It's more like I enjoy to watch them passing on the main. So the train driving experience for me with the passenger trains is not all that important. But for the freight trains, I like this American style of walk-along operation. So you follow your freight train around different industries and yards, and you set out and pick up cars from the different stops along the line, and eventually you come back to the yard with a new consist of your freight train. So this is a kind of 2 different way I want to operate the layout. So for me, the prototype comes second. And I don't go out and make an exact duplicate of some track work or some scenery out there, which is the leading thing for me. No, I apply that in a second step. So I first make sure I have the model railroad components, the components of track work, which makes it fun to operate. Now, so that's priority for me. And then I fit that into both the room I have available and also to some prototypic scenery, because I like anyway to have it some kind of connection with some real environments in real life out there. So we're gonna start there by checking out the components I've selected for my new model railroad.
So this is my new layout room. Basically to the right here is the garage part, and to the left is the hobby room. It has been or could been divided by a wall, but it's not. So that's why there are different dimensions on these 2 parts. I marked the position of the doors here, and here are the windows. So there are in total 3 windows looking out. Now in my previous location I had 1 hobby room or work room next door, so everything that was built had to be brought into the layout room. And in this case, in this room with this room width, I would like to have the workspace in here. So I decided to do that already up front. I will reserve a bit of space here for the workspace, where I have my cameras, light setup and everything ready to make tutorials for you. Going into this new layout design, I had not yet decided for prototype environments, but I've decided to make a linear line design. Now, based on previous experience, I've set a few parameters which must be followed. The first of those golden rules is the minimum walking clearance of 700 millimeters, and that is to allow passing. If you're with friends operating the layout at the same time simultaneously, you must be able to pass around each other, and then 700 millimeter is an absolute minimum. Another of these golden parameters is the framework height over floor, and that has to be at least 800 millimeters, otherwise you cannot comfortably make the installations under the table or maintain them or clean or anything under the table. So 800 millimeters. Then I typically make the framework height 100 millimeters, and that is to obtain a good stability of the framework so it doesn't sag or skew over time. And lastly, the depth of the landscape has to be 500 to 600 millimeters at least to give decent footage both for video and stills. And initially I had decided to go for a multi-deck layout. That means you have 2 bands on top of each other with landscape, which follows the walls around. and a big helix which transports the trains from one deck to the other. Now, to make this work properly, the helix must have a radius of at least 800 millimeters. Otherwise, I will not be able to pull long trains up. And since this is the main line and all of the trains will go through the helix, it really has to be a really wide radius helix. And placing that helix into this room, I quickly realized it will take up like 1/4 of the space. So my initial thought was to move it into the room next door, but I wanted to have that room as a 3D print studio. So, well, I had to let go of that multi-deck idea. So instead I had to go back to square one in terms of planning. And the first step in doing that is making a room sketch, which we already have here. I'm using AnyRail, as you might see, but you can also use paper and pencil. It works just as fine. So what you do next is you divide your room into squares. And each square should have the size of the smallest curve radius you can accept for your layout. In this case, it's 424 millimeters. With the squares in place, I make a few loops. So I would say a 180-degree curve using this radius, and I place them inside of the room just to get a feel for how much of the total space they will take up. In this first stage, I wanted to check if I had to make a layout around the walls of the room, or if I could have a centralized layout which I can walk around with a backdrop in the middle. I had this idea of have a peninsula where I could walk into the middle of it and have trains on both sides, but looking at this, it will not work. As mentioned previously, you need 700 millimeters of clearance here, and in this sketch we can see that we end up with like 200 millimeters instead. So I had to let go of that idea as well. At this point, I've now fine-tuned my ambitions with what's actually possible to achieve in the space I have. So let's go back to the 5-step planning process, meaning let's have a look at the components I really want to have on my layout. First priority for me is a station with at least 4 tracks with a track length of at least 1.8 meters, so I can fit 5 long passenger coaches with locomotives on the station. In this first sketch I also added the passing tracks for freight trains on each side. Then I want a central shunting place, or a division yard as the American calls it. It's a kind of centralized yard where all the switching activities is happening. As said previously, I want this layout to have a centralized backdrop, so I place that. It's the blue line in the middle. And then on top, on the other side of the backdrop, I place the parade route, a long stretch where you can enjoy the look of the trains. Then in the terminal north, I want an industrial area with at least 2 or 3 companies receiving and sending out goods. And after that, basically the line terminates into a loop. If we're instead following the line south from the passenger station, we will arrive to a harbor area. If you watched the previous video here on the channel, I was down in the Gothenburg harbor, and I got really hooked into the design and all the activities going on there. And the track work you see here is basically just an arrival track and a harbor track. I would probably fit more tracks into it. And following the loop or the line south will end up in the south loop, and this loop also contains train storage. And it will be a shadow station, and currently I have drawn 8 tracks here, but I probably need a few more. I decided early in the process not to include any engine facility, you know, with the roundhouse and turntable and all that. I've tried that now 4 times on previous layouts, and I never found it really fun to operate. It takes up massive amount of space. It's cool to look at, but only a few trains actually run there. But I might include a fueling track somewhere for the diesel. We'll see where it can fit. Let's now go over in 3D view. This layout you see here now is a bit polished. I have had some input from friends and people doing track work design. So it has been improved a bit. It's still sketchy and a draft, but you can at least see here now what the layout will basically look like. So here is the division yard on the back side, and you can see here also I've added a branch line which goes up and terminates in a kind of industrial area on top of the tunnel going out from the station. Here's the turnout to where the branch line, we'll say, starts, and here are some track works on the north terminal. So this is basically what the layout will look like. Now I think I'm happy with the content in general. I've taken some tracks off the main station to allow for more scenery, and same thing with the harbor. I've allowed more space in between the tracks to build scenery, like buildings and also nature. I'm still a bit, well, I haven't decided yet for if I'm gonna have this backdrop in the center or not. If not, then I instead divide layout using houses or trees, something like that, to get a distinct difference between the one side and the other.
All right, so there you have it. My new model railroad. It's kind of a centralized layout in the middle of the room. You can walk along with the freight trains, but you can also stand just by the central station there and watch the passenger trains pass by. I have also prepared now the components here for some scenery, a harbor. I like harbor very much, both to model it and to operate trains to and from, because it really allows for diversity of freight. And also I have long lines now to run both the passenger trains and freight trains. So I feel kind of happy with this layout, and it does for sure fit into my garage, which is a really good thing. And also one thing I might want to add later, I will see how, you know, I will fiddle around a bit with the tracks. Now, as you see, this track plan is very, as you say, it's a very generic track plan. The tracks will not look like that. The turnouts and everything once I got it finished. But it gives a kind of an outline of the functionality I want to have in the layout. So next, now in the next video coming up in 2-3 weeks, I've got an invitation from a guy here local in Gothenburg. He's really fluent in all the freight tracks around Gothenburg. So he will take me on the tour around and see what environments I could fit in, and adapt the track work slightly and the scenery, and voila, get a specific place for each of these industries, or these stops and the yard, and also so that will happen in the next video, and after that we'll eventually get started also on the framework construction. So that is what's happening next. Thank you very much for watching this video. If you want to support the channel, please become a patron. Get over to Patreon, set up a support account there from $1, $2, $4, $20 per month, or make a one-off donation using the PayPal dialog found in the video description below. If you're not yet a subscriber, subscribe to the channel, enable that little bell, and you will get a notification once the next video gets published. Until that happens, see ya.